Hey, you're listening to Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast where we celebrate all things spooky and mental health.
I'm your weirdo, Mark.
And I am the other host with Sentinel Titties, Josh.
Where
This
did that come from? What the
this
hell?
this part, man. There's that scene where Reggie rolls over and he's got the
Oh yeah,
hitchhiker. She's just got like a just like pops it open and sees the Sentinel boobs. I was like,
I
oh
don't forget
man,
that.
this movie just keeps getting weirder and weirder. Um, we are joined today by fresh from their run on Genre Blast. They are one of our top 10 uh short films from this year's Genre Blast. He is the co-writer and director on this one, Mr. Avishai Weinberger.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for stepping into the weird and wacky world of Phantasm.
I'm excited to stare into this particular abyss.
Uh,
I still
so am
stick with
I.
I still think this was my fault, wasn't it?
100%. Don't worry. I'm slowly plotting my revenge. It's been a fun time. I'm not gonna say it's not, but yeah. So Abishai is the like I said the co-writer and director of this brilliant short film called Blank. Um, can you kind of just like right off the bat just kind of tell us a little bit about what this movie's about?
Blank?
Hmm.
Sure. Blank is a half-hour short film that I co-wrote and directed with my sister, who co-wrote and acted. It is about a couple that is starting to have some problems when one of them starts having some episodes of forgetfulness that threaten to mutate into something worse. And as the two of them differ on how to approach that and how to deal with the problem, it threatens the relationship and then their lives.
Satova is Satova O Met 2Q.
Very close. It's Tova Umatuka.
I'm so terrible with names. I'm so sorry.
It's all
Uh,
good.
she's probably listening to this right now, throwing her phone across the room, angry. Uh, and
Hi,
being
Tova.
like, "We're victims and villains." Uh, so you guys are brother and sister. Was this the first time that you guys had worked together, and kind of what was the genesis of Blank?
So this wasn't the first time we have worked together, just because we grew up together, and she's always been an actor, and I've always been a filmmaker. So we've made stuff as kids, we've made stuff as teenagers, and we've done stuff on much smaller scales. This is the first time we wrote something together, and this is the first time that I directed her on a project that had I guess, as rigid a production as this, with a crew and a schedule and all that. So it felt like the first time we made a quote unquote real movie, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But yeah, when we came up with it, it was because she wanted more roles that would showcase her range, that were of a certain quality that she felt like she wasn't getting with the jobs she was landing. And I wanted to get behind the camera again because it had been a long time since my thesis film at NYU. So we sat down to write something that, worst comes to worst, we could shoot on an iPhone in our house, and then it just sort of grew from there.
Now I'm kind of curious. This movie it's really interesting, like tonally, because it has moments that are straight horror. It has moments that are very psychological. There are heartbreaking moments. There are heartwarming moments. It with this film in as a total, how would you guys say like how does this compare to other things that you guys have done before? How did past experience kind of affect the working and what each of you brought to Blank this time around?
Sure. So we knew that we wanted something that wouldn't just be one flat tone. Um, Partly because it's no fun to just play one flat tone as an
Sure.
actor. But partly because, our philosophy, and this is something that I try to bring to everything that I write, although usually what I write is much bigger budget and the reason why I haven't gone out and shot them. Um, our feeling is you really can't appreciate darkness in a story if there's nothing to compare it to.
Mm.
If all you're getting is seriousness, if all you're getting is bleak, then after a certain point, instead of feeling emotional about it, the audience just feels numb. It's like staring at a color for too long. If that's the only color you're looking at, it starts to look gray after a time. So the idea of having peaks and valleys, here's what happiness looks like so that we appreciate sad. Here's what, you know, like a secure relationship looks like so that we can appreciate when it's falling apart. It was all about making sure that everything stood in relief against everything else. So it's kind of like I'm really bugged by a trend in certain movies where when things are in a dark space, the whole image is just dim. And I find that the dark images that really stick with me are the ones that have really shocks of light in there. Like you watch The Descent, for example, these characters are in a cave underground. The only light is coming from whatever light they brought with them. And very frequently you have a mostly dark image, but with these really bright points of light that give you that contrast. And as a result, you remember the darkness. So I wanted that emotionally.
I think you guys really captured that spectacularly in here because there are these moments of hope, and that's the thing that I think that this is really honest. Whereas I feel like when you watch something like Split that, deals with similar thematic themes, there it just you walk away from that film and you just kind of feel like hopeless. It doesn't feel like there's any room for redemptions. Whereas you watch a film like Blank and it's dealing with very similar subject matter, but I think there's an emotional core to it with Tova and Alec that few other films that are addressing similar situations don't have. How important was it to keep this film at a grounded space, but also to have that emotional core last for you guys as well?
Oh, thank you. The way we approached it was just in any given moment, making sure that our characters were coming from somewhere real. Um, you know, the way that I like to direct, and this really developed on set too with with our other spectacular actors, Najib and Quentin. Um, we like to come to this from a place of, okay, this character in the script is saying something or doing something. Why is that? Where is that actually coming from? And it can't ever just be because right now it would be cool for the movie. It always has to come from somewhere honest. And so kind of working that out with the actors, we rehearsed it a lot. We made little tweaks if it was ever unclear. And if an actor was just stranded in a scene with nothing to do, we found something to do that felt organic to them. And out of all of that, I feel we ended up with something that felt grounded and human just by virtue of all of the characters were coming at their actions internally and organically, as at least that was the intent. Um, and that I think gave it a style that felt, I guess, it felt realistic. That as opposed to something stylized, where kind of the pose is the point. Where the result is the point, and here was about what result will we get, where the point is the intention. Does that answer your question?
Does. And so uh,
I
Tova
sometimes I feel like I'm rambling about this.
so Tova in the film also plays a character named Tova. And I'm also just kind of curious, like I don't know, like typically films that address mental health like head on, this feels like one of the more honest portrayals of that. Can you kind of talk about was there research that went into this? Like how were you guys able to really capture that the devastation not only of watching someone go through this, but also at the same time kind of Alex response of like watching his girlfriend go through it because I mean this film opens up and probably one of like the just a really like simple and like wholesome like story. and then it kind of like really delves into this insanity.
So yeah, I mean, one thing that we really did not want to do was demonize or stigmatize any particular mental illness or any people with mental illness. And so we kind of decided to instead of kind of looking into symptoms of actual illnesses, we kind of just came up with one and treated it more like a metaphor. And that way we felt this is a new thing. This isn't any real thing. And as we explore it, we just treat our characters like characters, instead of trying to do the sort of outside in, how would somebody with such and such diagnosis, etc. So it's been really a relief that people have come up to us and said that either like they felt seen or they've been close to somebody who has experienced this sort of thing. Because from our perspective, this was a metaphor about, a relationship falling apart where two people who are on the same page are no longer on the same page. One of them is changing and the other one isn't, and the one who isn't is trying to rein in the one who's going on a new path, and how that can be destructive to a relationship. So the change we made literal, but before we filmed it, we submitted the script to a short script competition called Killer Shorts, and it was a semifinalist in that, and they talked about it on their podcast, and they mentioned that Tova had DID. And Tova and I sat with each other and said, we want to make it clear that this isn't DID because we didn't research DID. We don't want to be making a statement on DID, because we're not experts and it's not necessarily our place in the story. We were just trying to create this metaphor. So we have threw in that line about how it's definitely not that. And in post-production on the edit, we deleted certain lines where, characters said, like, I looked online, I couldn't find anything about this, because we realized this is in practice, as we were filming this, as we were performing this, as we were editing this, it became clear that this thing that we kind of thought was an original thing is not quite as alien and unusual as we thought. It's actually a lot closer to things that real people experience. So we went out of a way to say, like, okay, we don't know what this is, the characters don't know what this is, but it's not necessarily an undiscovered country, so to speak. And then we left the diagnosis vague, and just focused on, these are two humans in a situation who are grappling with this and have their own perspectives on it. And that's all we did. And it was just an incredible relief that people saw that and said that they felt seen by that. Because at the end of the day, we're just portraying humans.
That's one of the things that I think really helped me as a viewer really stick with it. Um, Stick with playing is probably the reasons that it ended up so highly on the top 10 short films list, is because it feels honest, but also at the same time, I think I can see a lot of the things you're talking about now in retrospect as well.
Yeah, I feel like horror as a genre, and we approached this as horror, even though we made sure that the tone varied over the course of the story. It allows us to look at real things in life without looking directly at that thing. We get to exaggerate, we get to distort, we get to look at it through a completely different lens. And that kind of lets us look closer at it than if we were just looking starkly at the true reality. So treating it like a metaphor and kind of like a fable, I think was probably a gift that we accidentally gave ourselves, because it meant that we got to look at something real from an angle that actually got us closer to it, as opposed to if we had sat down and said, we are going to make a movie about mental illness, and we are going to do our research, and we are going to uh you know do what we can to be sort of accurate to testimonials and all that. It might have rung false, because that it would have felt, I think, outside in, and instead we just created something from the inside out that surprisingly resembled something true.
Where can we currently like follow the festival run news? Are you guys playing in any festivals coming up soon? What's the festival run look like for you guys?
We are submitted to more festivals. To be candid, I have no idea if we'll get into any of them, just because it is a long short. It's 30 minutes long, and that tends to get kicked out of festivals. It's hard to program something that long. So it's entirely possible that this was the end of its run, and then at some point we'll release it online in one form or another. We don't have distribution yet. We're looking into that. But in the meantime, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Avishai Oddity. That's AVISHAIODDITY. Or you can follow my sister at Supernova Tova. And when things come up, we'll let you know.
All right. Well, let's jump into the weird and wacky world of Phantasm for Oblivion. But I will say this one more time. If you guys get a chance to see Blank, whether it's online or you guys are lucky enough to see it in this festival run, I cannot recommend it enough. It is a great short. It's well acted. It's well written. It is well paced. And don't let the 30 minutes throw you off. I mean, you take however long you need to take to tell a story. So,
Well, thank you very much.
all right. Well, Avishai, we'll keep this on you. What is your relationship to the Phantasm movies?
I discovered them late. A few years ago, I read Don Coscarelli's book, the director of the Phantasm films. Have you ever read his book?
I didn't even know he had written a book until I think it was the first,
You know
like
what?
in indie something.
Yeah, it's called True Indie. It's
Yeah.
a memoir of his life and how he's made all these movies over the years on low budgets and breaking the rules and all that. And I read the book, and that led me to his movies. So I started. I think I binged the four and a half, five. Did we count the fifth one? Because he didn't do the fifth one. But the Phantasm films I watched basically in a row, kind of in a week, a couple years ago.
Yeah,
Mark,
we're kind of finding that that's the general consensus. Is somebody starts watching the first like one or two, and they just kind
want
of
to see
keep
where
going
it
down the rabbit
goes.
hole.
Yeah, and I will say I have a lot of feelings about these movies, a lot of thoughts about them because they are not normal movies.
Uh-uh. I think we've spent probably like half our time on this series, like even in the first one, like just like asking questions, theorizing, and like spending more time talking about theories than we do at the actual like qualities of these movies.
Well, they appear to be slowly starting to answer some questions a little bit. A little bit. Very
I
little bit.
Yeah,
uh,
That's my issue with the series so far, is that each one tends to have more questions left than answers.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Yeah, it's you see, here's my take on these movies. Kind of my broad sort of 30,000 foot take. I think he made the first one. He made it as a, as a very young budding filmmaker. He was following his gut more than he was following his brain, and that resulted in this beautifully surrealist art film, essentially. Right? It is not a plot driven movie. It is not a logic driven movie, but at all. He created something, whether intentionally or not, that has this very specific dream logic that is a really hard thing to bottle. It's lightning in a bottle, and then he had to do it again in sequels, which I don't think he expected to do when he made that first one. And so, he made that second sequel, or he made that first sequel rather, Phantasm II. He had a budget all of a sudden. This first movie cost a couple $100,000. He made it as a kid, made the sequel with $3 million, but pre-adjusting for inflation, and created something a lot bigger and a lot more Sam Raimi-esque and a lot more plotty. And me personally, I love the surrealist aspects of these movies, and I find that when they try to root themselves in a logic or in plot, they start to lose me. And I feel with two and three, and the third one cost $2.5 million, and starts bringing in these post-apocalyptic warrior types, and really lean into the plot and the comedy and all that. I felt like it was losing what made the first one work for me. What made the first one work for me is I feel like that's the kind of thing that you could experience in an actual nightmare, where you're getting all these images and all these vibes and this sort of disconnected temporality. And then you wake up and say, wait a minute, none of that made any sense. But in the moment, you're flowing with it. And the second you try to apply structure, which he does in the second and third movies, to me, it's not as effective. And then he makes his fourth one where, and I had to look this up, he was trying to make a fourth one with a different script that Roger Avery of Pulp Fiction wrote, called Phantasm Ends, or Phantasm 2012, I think it was called. And it was going to be this big finale with all of this plotty stuff about the tall man taking over America, essentially, and creating this wasteland between New York and California. And then these warriors have to go battle him and his army. And they couldn't raise the funds for it, but he could raise $650,000. So suddenly he's going from a $3 million and a $2.5 million movie to a sub $1 million movie that he cannot afford to make what he wanted to make. And at the same time, he gets a call from his, from the chemists who developed the film for the first movie saying, hey, FYI, we're shutting down, and we just found a whole bunch of canisters of Phantasm 1 footage that was cut out, and it's in perfect condition. So Don Coscarelli looks at that and says, I can make a movie for $650,000 where 15% of it has already been shot. And he brings in these deleted scenes from the first movie, and he writes a script around it, and he plans it to be a prequel to the one that they can't get funded yet, with the hopes that this one will be successful, and then they can get the funds and do that final movie. So he creates this sort of almost in-betweenish story, and then he can't get the funds to do that final one, so they never do that final one. And as a result, he kind of captures, for me, that lightning in a bottle from that first one, where it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's just this sort of emotional logic, this nightmare logic, and there are these interesting thematic underpinnings that come out of that, whether on purpose or by accident, that to me I have a real soft spot for, because I think it touches on some really interesting things, intentionally or not, with this beautiful dreamlike logic, whether intentional or not, that might have just been a result of them not being able to afford to make the epic they wanted to make.
I I'm really glad that they didn't get budget like money for this one, because I I really was had a lot of fun with two. In some aspects, I like two a little bit more than I like the first film, but then the third film, as I talked about last week, kind of lost me a little bit. Like it felt like it try to outstep its bridges. It's like it was this indie darling that, all of a sudden now has money and fame and fans, and it just kind of lost me. Whereas with this film, I feel like it's basically taking these characters back to their roots without actually retaining or stepping back from anything that has gone before it. Like one of the things that we talked about last week is like we made the joke about like how in these sequels Reggie is kind of like now not only is he him and Mike being like this emotional core of these characters, but Reggie is kind of like this like comedic relief where
And
like
well,
he's
Reggie's
always
also kind of become the star of the series.
yeah. Yeah, it like Reggie, like, one of the things that like is established in like the second one and then again in the third one, it's established here is like this running joke that like every girl that Reggie comes across, like he's trying to get
Tries
into
to
their
pick up.
pants. It's so like it's this running gag, and I appreciate it how like this one is a return to form, but it still like honored the sequels that had led it to this fourth entry.
So we're watching them fairly close together. And part of the issue I'm having is I'm starting to mix up things from certain movies with the other movies and stuff. Or am I the only one that's happening to watching them this close together like that?
Well, full disclosure, I watched all these movies way back, when I watched them a few years ago. And for this podcast, I only rewatched four. I did not go back to the other ones because as far as I'm concerned, the continuity and lore of these movies is a trap. And the only
Yes.
lore that really matters is vibes. And this particular movie, I feel, tells you everything you need, everything it needs you to know. Because remember, like in two, like they completely violate the canon of like the final scene of the first movie. Like there's no actual internal logic, and the trap I think of watching them all back to back is trying to follow them as a thread, whereas what they really are just this crew of filmmakers every few years going out and making some more movie stuff, you know, and then
It
assembling them at some point.
it almost feels like they had an episode of South Park many years ago where they just had like manatees pulling random balls to come up with a theme for an episode. And that's kind of what it feels like at times because it's really hard to find any coherence in the story other than Reggie's chasing the tall man to save Mikey and the tall man's after Mike. That's kind
Yeah.
of like the only story. That's it.
And
But then you
also
get
that's
all, yeah.
oh,
And
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh no, go ahead.
Oh, just also that South Parkism of how many times are we gonna kill Kenny here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but like in some ways, like I feel like one of the more interesting facts or things about Oblivion is the fact that they are a finally answering, however half-hearted it is, the connection between the tall man and Mike, and then also at the same time, like you're getting
What did they
your
what did they say the actual connection was? I'm having a brain fart.
yeah, um, it's like they that's the thing is that from because I watched it earlier today, but like they never like give you like an outright reason as to why they're connected, just that they are connected because this is the first one where we learn that his name is Obadiah.
Jebediah.
Jebediah. He was
Yeah.
thinking about The Simpsons. He's thinking about he was this like Undertaker that had like you got to see like an Elseworlds like version of him, and Jody essentially took him back to kind of like where it all began.
Yeah, and he was like a scientist messing with what I'm guessing was portal jumping, dimension hopping or something. And it just said that he goes into the other world, the red world, and came back different.
Yeah, it's
Yes. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I'll say, just watching this one again now, that my feeling, like if I were to apply some sort of logic to the tall man and his relationship with these characters, it's that this guy comes from a universe with different rules, different logic, and his when he enters your life, he is changing the logic of your life going forward and also retroactively. Like it's like he's altering their pasts, he's altering their futures just by virtue of them crossing paths, and it affects everybody they run into, right? Like that hitchhiker. Like I'm not going to assume that hitchhiker was always a minion of the tall man. I'm not going to assume that like the tall man like came in the middle of the night and like turned her into like a minion. It's just she entered the logic stream and now she's part of it. And I find that on a plot level, that is what it is. But I find it so fascinating on an emotional and thematic level, especially in this particular movie, because this is a movie about people who are just full of regrets, who wish that they can change their past, and are reckoning with the fact that they cannot prevent their doom. And and the way that we see that is by having flashbacks to things that never happened, by going back in time to prevent this from happening, realizing that they actually can't change that at all. They can only watch. And as they're like planning for the end, and the tall man keeps coming to them and saying, "This isn't when it happens. It'll happen soon. I know when it'll happen." And when they go at him and try to stop it, they can't do anything. It's just their doom just sort of happens, and they all just sort of, you know, play into it. So, like to me, whatever the logic of the relationship with Mike and Reggie and the tall man is, the metaphor is so much stronger, again, intentional or not, of he is death. He's always been with them and he will always be with them. And ending on that final note of this movie in particular, which I don't know if we're going to spoil right this second, just kind of nails it home of this is a story about, you know, raging against the dying of the light, knowing that you're going to have to succumb to it anyway, and knowing that there's nothing you could have done to prevent it.
Well, they also, and hopefully I'm not mixing up something that was said in 5 with 4, because I watched those two back to back.
I
They
haven't
make
watched five yet, so don't spoil anything.
well, they make a
I don't know how to
comment.
spoil 5.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere in 4, but hopefully it was. I don't remember because, like I said, they're kind of blurring together because the whole
Lay it on
series
me.
is so weird. They make a comment about the tall man, that he's almost godlike, that he can
Mm,
manipulate your dreams, he can shapeshift, he can alter reality, he can mess with time and all kinds of junk.
pretty sure that's five.
That might be
Okay,
5.
sorry about
And
that.
5, I believe, and I have to remind myself, Don Coscarelli, I think, is a producer on it, but I believe that it is directed and written by a fan of the series.
That's fascinating. I will be recording it in a couple, recording that episode in a couple of days. So
Yeah.
I haven't watched it yet. So
Well,
It is a very different feeling.
yes, yes, it is.
well, like
But yeah, I couldn't remember if that was from 4 or 5, but it explains a lot, that if he is able to do all this, why things are so weird and jumpy and seem to alter.
also too, right? Because like the idea of like just taking the concept of God it into question, that like the concept of God is essentially a being that is stands outside of time and is like I think probably a better way to put it is like the way that Dr. Manhattan talks about it is like you can see literally past, present, and future literally all at the same time. And so it makes sense the way that like if the tall man ends up actually being a god, that we would kind of see this, like I said this way back in our second episode, that to me, tall man almost kind of feels like he operates as Pennywise does,
Hmm.
where Pennywise is essentially the Lucifer of the macro or whatever thing calls his universe. But it's him and the giant floating turtle that is like that version of God, and essentially like they operate in the constructs of like how we know God and how we know the devil. And it almost kind of seems like that is kind of how they position the tall man in this one, but also at the same time, like you also kind of see it like you could make arguments that like some of Mike's journey into in this movie are reminiscent of like Jesus in the desert, being tempted by the devil.
I'm not super familiar with that lore, to be honest.
It's fine. Basically, the story goes is like Jesus uh after he had gone through and been baptized in the Holy Spirit, had been led to go fast in the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. And in the midst of that, the devil had tempted him 3 times, and every time like God, Jesus had essentially been like, you say this, but it is written, insert scripture here. And that's the kind of concept to where like you can definitely kind of see that Mike is really wrestling with, the idea of potentially becoming the tall man at certain points in this one. Um, and you can kind of see him like wrestling with like his own humanity is kind of like the comparison between the stories I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I could see it. And I think also just that sense of, like the stuff that the tall man wants to do to him, which is either, destroy him or change him or whatever that is, whatever that turns out to be, there is this hanging sense of inevitability, that this is going to happen and there's really no way out of it. And he's just slowly walking into it. And it's yeah, I don't know. I just find that aspect of it fascinating, especially since, when we see the tall man in the past, right? When we see him first become created, um, when he walks out of that portal and he is himself, he sees them there standing and watching, even though they're phased out of that reality, and then, the normal Jebediah couldn't see him. And he responds, he looks at them and says, and so it begins. Just a sense of this is just always going to happen, no matter what anybody did. This was in motion since the 1800s.
So, all right. So I'm
I
curious. Go ahead,
I
Mark.
just made a very strange connection, and I think it might be coincidence, but maybe
Is it going to
not.
be from this movie?
Yes, and the
It's
series as a whole. It's very similar overall to, was it the story of Orpheus going into Hades to save his wife? You've got
Mm.
Reggie going through hell up against essentially Hades, the tall man, to save Mike.
Yeah.
Or you could even
See
look
that.
at it as a similar story in some aspects to Dante's Inferno, with Jodie playing the role of the kind of guide.
Hmm.
What I think is
I don't
fascinating.
know. I don't know why those two just came to mind
I
as
but
to how the
I like that. I like that, especially
it
the idea of, because in Orpheus, at the end of the day, we all know how that turns out, right?
yeah,
Sure.
but it makes a lot of the series make sense.
It does, but I mean, one of the things that I think that we've talked about is like every entry into this franchise so far feels a little bit different than what has come before it. And this one definitely kind of retains some of that coming of age story because this entire film feels like while you definitely have the plot line of Reggie trying to find Mike, you are also having Mike go through this solo journey to try and better understand the connection to the tall man, the Sentinels, what is Jody in all of this? Like it's this giant mystery that he is continuously trying to unwrap and it haunts him. I think one of the most haunting images in this movie is when he's asleep in the back of the hearse and he's having the nightmare of like discovering the sentinel in his head. And like it's a gold sentinel, and the only other time you've seen a gold sentinel thus far is in the second one when you find out that the All Man also has the gold sentinel in his.
And they also release a gold sentinel in the second one. So
Yes, that's also the only other
there
time we've seen it.
yeah, there's two gold sentinels that they've showed. And they do show, was it in three? They start to show it in Mikey's head, and then in four they actually
Hmm.
do show it.
Yeah.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me a little bit of in the first Candyman film, where, our protagonist Helen is rooting around in the world of Candyman, who is this being who's basically generated from shared belief in story. And as she gets sort of further down this rabbit hole with him, she becomes more retroactively entangled into his story. Like now she's in the mural with him. Now she's always been part of his origin. It was always you, Helen, he says. And, you know, from a linear time and space aspect, that wasn't always the case. Like she is now, she wasn't always. But by getting closer and closer to the story, she is becoming more retroactively woven into it. And that's kind of how I feel about Mike and the Tall Man of, the way I see it, the Tall Man entered Mike's life and has ensnared him to the point where Mike was always in the Tall Man's life.
But they never, because the tall man keeps saying, "Oh, I have plans for him. He's part of the game, and this and that." But they never say what his actual role is.
Right. And to me, that's just all part of the whole, he is the subject of an obsession. And he is being further and further integrated into something that he wasn't always part of. Because what's the best way to claim something as yours is to get it to a place where you could say it was always yours. And that's how I feel about it. It's a very specific kind of stalking. And whether that's how they intended or not, that's how it resonated with me, because it also just kind of goes hand in hand with how they made these movies. When Don Coscarelli wrote these movies, he didn't know that there was always going to be some plan. But the more he makes sequels, the more entwined they get in retrospect.
I'm
And
curious
the,
on that note, like real quick, like two and three kind of expand the world, and this one kind of brings it back down to where it's just these characters, so much so that we even have the callback to Reggie's original getup in the first film with the ice cream truck vendor, and he's got the little bow tie. And so I'm kind of curious, like, do you guys think that these films work better when they are fixating themselves on the relationship of these core cast of characters, or when they kind of go out past these core characters as well?
I think it works best when they keep the core characters intact in their story. And I think the whole thing somehow, as confusing as the series is, somehow works, being as weird as it is and incoherent. It's a
Yeah,
combination of the two. Somehow they have made being incoherent and weird work the best with the main characters.
Look at David Lynch.
yeah.
And it's funny because I've been watching horror for 40 years, 35 years, something like that. And I never really sat down and watched any of these, other than like the first one I had seen once or twice. But it's like, why haven't I watched these before? And I remember seeing the pictures of the tall man and the sentinel everywhere growing up. And I still, even before we did this, I'd still see pictures of him and references to him off and on all over the place. So it's kind of cool going through them now and really checking out the series finally.
Yeah, I find that the more they expand the world and turn it into a world building experiment, the more they bring in outside characters and create lore, the further it gets from what I love about the series, which is this very kind of focused surrealism of these particular people's world getting inverted. And I know it wasn't the initial plan, but I love that they jettisoned the to me the excess weight of the middle two sequels and said, let's just get back to this avant-garde surrealism. And I should point out, by the way, you made that joke about the Sentinel breasts. That's from the unmade script. That's from the
That's awesome.
that was something from Roger Avery's finale script. There was going to be a big sequence of that, and they couldn't get that made, so they stuck it in here. And honestly, Reggie and his bizarre leering over younger women thing has never clicked for me as a viewer, and to me it's the weaker part of this movie. But whenever we are with Mike and Jody, that's when it really connects with me because there isn't that single foot in the real world with Reggie. He feels like a person who wandered into these movies, and he keeps encountering other people who get sort of like sucked into the whirlpool of these movies and their logic. And for a moment, you remember that you're watching a movie. For a moment, you're like, oh, these are characters dealing with horror monsters. And then whenever you're with Mike, he's like on his own plane of existence. He's like monologuing in his head. He's tying himself like a noose on a tree. He's having dreams where his eyes turn silver. He's making things move around in the engine of his car with his mind. And like he's just not on terra firma anymore at all. And that's the stuff, especially with his relationship with Jody, because Jody, right, he died in the first film off screen. We're told it happened in sort of like, that Jody could that all this was false, all this was a dream because Jody couldn't have been involved because he was dead the whole time. And Reggie is the one telling this, who we saw die in the first one, but now he's alive again. So what is real, what isn't? Then it turns out the tall man is real, but so is Reggie. And like this whole like what was real, what isn't. And this particular movie just delves more into that of like, oh yeah, well, remember all these things that happened, and here are these scenes that never happened. Like, oh, where remember that time that they lynched the tall man? Remember that time that they passed him by in the road? Remember that time that the tall man captured Jody in his bedroom? It's like that all didn't happen, but maybe I'm just misremembering the dream. And then ending like as Jody is dying in this one, saying, "Oh, I died in the car crash." It's like, what do we take that to mean? Is that just him saying, like, that's the preferable narrative, you should choose that one to remember me by? Or is that saying this was all false, that was true? And after a certain point, it doesn't even really matter because whatever is true, whatever is not, it can all hurt you. And these characters are getting just stuck into this hell that they cannot seem to claw their way out of.
Yeah, and Reggie started off as like this little side prop character almost for part of the original movie.
He,
Yeah.
yeah, like even when you go back and rewatch that first film, Reggie feels like not quite an afterthought, but definitely a secondary character. And so it feels like a weird narrative decision in the second one to kind of make it feel like it's a buddy cop kind of feel to it. And he to me has always kind of been like what you're saying. He definitely feels like the comedic relief, but also at the same time it kind of takes you out of this entire experience. And it kind of almost feels like really weird decisions. Whereas when you look at the first film and the fourth film, they feel very much independent. And then you look at the second and third film, and the way that characters are handled, the way that the world is explored, definitely has a lot more of like that mainstream appeal to how to go to a wider audience. It's more action packed, it has more jokes. There's a little bit more like sex humor that's in it that you don't really get the first or the fourth one.
Did
And
they
to
ever
me, go
did
ahead.
they ever explain what happened to Timmy? Where he went?
It's according to IMDb trivia, they were going to have a scene of him getting eaten by the little creatures, but they couldn't afford it.
Wild.
So they just decided, you know what, we're just gonna let you wonder
Well,
what happened to Timmy.
I mean, characters fall out of dreams all the time. right?
Yeah.
Like you'll be having a
Facts.
dream about one particular thing, you get a little caught on a tangent, and then that previous thing just isn't there anymore, you know? So Timmy never existed. And I feel like the way that these movies treat Reggie also feels like Don Coscarelli wrote Reggie as a, you know, a third supporting character in the first one, and then they probably just got along really well on set. And it's just like, hey, if I make another one, would you come back? And he'll be like, hell yeah. And like it definitely feels like this is the director and the actor making more movies together, not this director having plans for this character. It's more just like buddies getting back together and just doing this again.
It's almost
Which you can tell is something that he cares about because you know they recast Mike in the second one, which was a studio thing, and the second he could, he brought back the original Mike.
Hmm.
yeah.
I'm curious, how
It's
do you go ahead?
it's almost like the Walmart version of Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell.
Well, I mean, Sam Raimi is name checked in the second movie.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you guys feel about Reggie in these, like, as a character in these movies overall? Like, he's entertaining, but like in terms of like pushing the plot forward, I think this one, again,
You
we
have
as we've been
you have
saying,
to have a plot to make it go forward.
this one does have a plot. It is the origin story of the tall man, my friend. But let's be real. Like, if you took Reggie out of this movie, it feels like you could still just give more screen time to Mike and Jody, and this movie might be more interesting. Not to say that it's not, but I don't
So
know. Reggie's kind of
so
You
like a
know,
throwaway character in this one.
as much as I prefer the Mike and Jody stuff personally, just because of how outlandish it is, I feel like you kind of need Reggie because you need that levity. By contrast, Mike is so serious to the point where he's almost not human anymore, just as a person. And I feel like having somebody who is deeply sincere and deeply committed to all of this stuff, who can also get battered around, um, I feel like that's important. I would totally do without the bizarre, you know, leering over every woman he comes across. Like he's like that is very like a juvenile man wrote this script, you know, like it's incredibly strange and it keeps happening. And I don't know, that doesn't work for me. But the idea of him as like this friend who is loyal and committed and sincere, I feel like that is a little necessary, if only for the thematic arc of, hey, death is coming for us, what do we do about it? And having, you know, this one person being like, well, fuck that. You know, like the one guy who is just like, I don't even know if that's true. You know, like there's something to be said for that. However, I do think he exists at this bizarre intersection of endearing and incredibly creepy. I mean, he's this guy in a 1970s ice cream parlor costume lusting after random women. Like it's very strange. I don't know how you come up with that.
I
Like
mean,
that feels
he's got a sweet car though.
He does have a sweet
he
car.
he is probably the most midlife crisis character I've ever seen in a movie. You know.
Yeah, that's actually probably the best explanation for Reggie. Is yeah,
Yeah,
that
I
makes a
mean,
lot
he's
that is
because
also not wrong.
because he's got the sweet car, he's got the awesome car, and he's hitting on every young girl he comes across.
he has a guitar.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's I don't know. I find him both appealing and off-putting. I don't think the movies are right without him. I also feel like there's only like you can only put so much of him in. Like it's kind of like adding salt or sugar to something. Like you really don't want to overdo it because eventually it's just gonna make you puke. So
Yeah,
too
like
much of Reggie makes me puke.
I enjoy, like, what Reggie brings to these movies. And I think like overall, like if you were to take the character Reggie out, it wouldn't quite feel like a Phantasm movie anymore. But also at the same time, like I feel like you could definitely operate. And like what I think it was Marx, you had said like that Mike is like ridiculously like over the top, just like super serious like all the time. And there's technically nothing wrong with that. But I mean, also horror around this time had gotten thematically lighter, and so like you needed a lot more characters like Reggie to kind of appeal to a larger audience, essentially. How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Well, they don't even seem like movies that represent the time frame of horror that they came from, because they're so spread out during different eras of horror, but none of them feel like the era they came from. They all feel like cheesy 80s movies.
It's funny because like I would say that the second and third feel like cheesy 80s movies, and the first one feels like an Italian, like, surrealist, thing. And the fourth one feels like something you would discover on VHS in the very back of a store. Um, like it almost feels like not a movie in its way. And I say that also thinking that it is a thematically heavy movie. Like I think it actually has a lot to say, um, whether it means to or not. Like I'm noticing one of the things that I like about Reggie that I think connects him to Mike, that other characters in this series don't have is they don't have a home base anymore. They're completely disconnected from their lives. Like at the beginning, they Reggie had a job, Mike had a family, they lived in a place. They don't have anybody anymore except for each other, but they don't have jobs, they don't have time frames. They're just out on the road. And that's why like whenever you introduce a character who's like I'm a road warrior or something, it's like, all right, well, you're rooted in something. But these guys are unmoored and they're alone. Even when they're together, they're kind of alone and they're dying and they're dying slowly and they can't stop it. And that to me is Phantasm. And it's, they mention in this movie also, like they keep talking, like the tall man like points out to Mike, like you have no one. And he doesn't reconnect with Reggie until the very, very end, and they don't get to have to spend a moment together before Mike is, you know, mortally question mark wounded with a wound that he has in the opening scene, by the way. So I don't know what's up with that, but it's all very. There is this thematic through line of dying alone that is so, dying alone with nothing but your thoughts and your memories and your regrets, but not having accepted any of it, and not that your non-acceptance does anything about it. Like there's that one line where Reggie is in bed with that hitchhiker, which again, I don't buy that for even a half a second. But taken on face value of like, okay, they've clicked as people, they're in bed together, and then she says, I like you, but I make but I make a point of not getting serious with anybody who has bigger problems than I do. Mm-hmm. And I think that ties into the whole moroseness of it all. Of these are, you know, for one thing, I think that that's something that people with mental illness have definitely heard before from prospective partners. You know, I think it's and it ties into that feeling of, hey, you, this particular character, you're gonna rage against the dying of the light, but you are dying alone. And then at the end, at the end of the movie, and I'm gonna spoil it because I don't know what your spoiler policy is on this show.
Go for it.
Um, but the very end of Mike is dying. Reggie leaves him alone to go into that portal after the tall man, which, like, what's he gonna do? Right? Like, what are you gonna do to stop the tall man at this point? So he leaves Mike alone, dying in the middle of the desert, Death Valley, ha ha ha. Funeral mountains, it says on a sign at one point. It's not subtle at all. And they're like dying, like words are carried on the wind to their younger selves, who then dismiss it as nothing. You know, it's just this intense, crippling loneliness of death. And, you know, and frankly, if I were Don Coscarelli and I got money to make a fifth and final film, it would be entirely about accepting death. You know, like that's really the only thing that's left for these characters to do. And I think it would be insincere to defeat death. I think it would be insincere, you know, for them to win. But the only victory that they could get is coming to terms with it, because that's something that they're not able to do in any of these things. And I think that's the only way they could end the nightmare. So, like, thematically, I think it's heavy as hell. But then, you know, just filtered through this low budget B movie, fourth film in a franchise, made because they needed to make another Phantasm at some point or other. You know, it has such a strange feeling. You know, it's like a gem kind of hidden in this bizarre kind of like dirt in the middle of this desert.
So this far into the series, I'm almost wondering what would happen if somebody did like a, a Michael Bay Chainsaw Massacre quality remake of the original. Could it be pulled off and make a good movie, or would it just fall flat like the Nightmare on Elm Street one did? Could you pull some coherence out of it, make it a little more clear, gives answer some more questions that are missed?
I
I
would go. Wait, what do you say?
I was gonna before I jump into to your question, Mark. I want to address some of the things that Avishai had said, specifically about this. You know, one of the things that like I feel like I've been struggling with personally recently is like having the perspective of, you know, not being guaranteed a tomorrow, or like actually thinking about death, because I don't think we consider death until it's too late, or we don't, or worse, on the other side of that coin is we consider death if our life now is too bad. You know, that old adage of suicide is a temporary solution, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so I love the fact that this is kind of, because the older you get, the more you have this tendency to think about death. You think about the longevity of life and your mortality, and the specifically that kind of the way this movie ends with them kind of whispering back to their younger selves, I think is such a poetic ending to these characters' journeys. And it really does, like they say that, like, you know, mental health is one of those things that, and also mental illness is one of those things that's always really hard to talk about. It's always really hard to be vulnerable, but you have films like Phantasm that remind us that these kind of conversations are important, because you don't know what tomorrow holds. Um, and so I just want to encourage everyone to, like, you know, the importance of community, so that, you know, you're not at ending, you know, you're not at the end of your life and you're not finding yourself similarly to like Mike or Reggie or Jody, where there is no community, there is no alone, because community could be one of the most valuable things for your mental health.
I
It's
mean,
part of the reason that I love podcasting. It's part of the reason I love doing shows and going to film festivals and conventions, is because there's this overwhelming sense of camaraderie and welcoming, and you could just kind of be yourself and be vulnerable. And it's also kind of really sad in retrospect to think about some of the things that um Passarelli like really addresses in this film thematically.
And something I want to point out also, something that I think is really apparent while you're watching like while you're watching all four movies in a row, just by nature of the fact that they're all made, over a period of time. But I think it's especially obvious even within this own movie because of all of these flashbacks they have, is that these characters are very visibly and to us rapidly aging, right? Like you watch four movies in a row, you're going from, these very young people to people who, are older. Some of them have, like this sort of like wear to them, um, that is really apparent just in the flashing back and forward, that I think just adds to the whole vibe of we're all just sort of barreling towards an end. Like these characters in this movie who are like no longer a little boy, no longer a, like a 20 or 30 something year old ice cream vendor, it's like, remember when we were, but that's over, and that can't be gone. We can't go back to that. We can only kind of go forward. And Reggie putting on his old costume even just kind of highlights that he is not that guy anymore. And it's, to get back to what you were saying, Mark, about what a remake of this would look like. I would go, if it were me, if I were the god of, you know, film rights and green lighting, I would go the full opposite of what you were saying. And instead of doing a Platinum Dune style, very kind of glossy and very well produced remake that digs into the lore and makes it, answers questions, I would barrel full into the surrealism. I would leave reality behind and have nothing but theme, because I think if you're coming at it from a place of a remake instead of kind of creating it in the first place, where in the first place you land somewhere that you maybe didn't intend, with a remake you can go in with intention. And I think the thing that makes Phantasm special is the fact that it isn't tethered to questions and answers. It isn't tethered to that sort of mystery. It's kind of like the theme tune to season two of The Leftovers, which I don't know if you've seen. But season two of The Leftovers, which has this big overarching mystery of where did 2% of all humanity vanish to, the theme music tells you maybe we should just let the mystery be. And to me, it's less a mystery of like, it's less a question of why in these movies and more a question of what now, and what about it. And I think the idea of exploring a new story with maybe new characters, but in a world with the tall man is, the tenuous grasp of reality, and the fallibility of memory, and the fact that you can't trust the things that you're comfortable with to help you, because they may or may not even be real, and they might not be there tomorrow if they were there yesterday. I would lean into that. I would take it away from Platinum Dunes, and I would give it to A24.
Yeah. Or or Neon, I think would be another
Yeah.
great one as well. Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things you're saying. I would love to see it in like the hands of like either a really weird, you know, really embrace the roots of this, because I think that's why Oblivion hits as well as it does, is because it returns thematically, stylistically, narratively, it returns to its core roots of 1979. So, uh, my thing is, if I had to do this, if I was in the position of giving this over to a filmmaker, uh, real weird choice here. But if we were gonna get weird and kind of bloody and graphic, uh, I would go Rob Zombie for one, would be one filmmaker I would do.
Mm.
And Zombie, I think Zombie, as far as like weirdness and strangeness, kind of gets slept on sometimes in the conversation, because most people know him because he does, kind of like real like white America redneck hillbilly kind of sorts, but then you watch something like The Munsters and you can kind of see how really bizarre he can get, or you turn
Halloween
around and
too.
Halloween 2, Lords of Salem, like they're he's explored a lot of like really weird movies thematically. 31's another weird one, but I think he would be really good to potentially take a stab at a modern day one. But if we're talking like on these like deeper themes, and also trying to get weird, I think Michael Sarnowski, who directed Pig, would also perhaps be another good
Mm.
one. Because Pig is this the more the plot keeps developing, the weirder the movie gets. But it's like also like retains a lot of these like really beautiful, deep themes as well.
Yeah, I would give it to David Robert Mitchell, who did, It Follows and Under the Silver Lake, because he can take your grounded feeling reality and just slowly kind of like sink that into this netherworld of disconnect. Or I would give it to Panos Cosmatos, who just makes it fully lurid and it's all vibes. The one person I would definitely not give it to, who I think on in theory is the perfect person for it because he approaches these things with this very specific kind of theme, is Mike Flanagan. Because on one hand, he seems kind of perfect for it because he likes to explore death and and our relationship to it, but he likes to explain it. He likes to talk through it. And I think the thing about Phantasm is it's these are nonverbal movies. These are hallucinations and they get you talking about it afterwards, but I think it has to be up to us to interpret the hallucinations.
Agreed.
My thought would have been Avi Arad. The way he did, or I might have the name wrong. Dude
Ari
did
Aster.
Hereditary.
Ari
Yeah, Ari
Aster.
Aster. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. No,
Avi
I
Arad,
was.
producer of Spider-Man.
Yeah, yeah. I knew there was two Avis in Hollywood.
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
Avi Arad and Ari Aster with an R.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I think he could do a good job with it, with the way he did Hereditary and just completely did the complete opposite with Midsummer, and the way he tells the tales with the hidden details that you can miss if you're not paying attention, and really gets in depth with that kind of stuff. And the details just come out more and more the more you watch something. I think he could put an interesting take on it.
Oh, you know who would be excellent? Issa Lopez of Tigers Are Not Afraid.
Oh, oh, it's over.
Because because you look at something like that and it's so emotionally resonant and it is very much telling a story, but it's also very much not holding your hand with a consistent reality. And reality slips plenty in that, but the themes are all there and it feels like a dream.
Yeah, go check out our episode on Tigers Are Not Afraid from earlier this year. It's been one of my favorite films to cover this year. It's beautiful. If you guys haven't seen it yet, but we got one more left in the chamber, and that apparently is called Ravisher that Mark has watched before we record it.
Ravager. Ravager.
Our friend
Phantasm Ravager.
our friend
Yeah.
Billy will be back to join us for that. Uh
Billy.
yeah. But any closing statements you guys have about Oblivion? Any other trivia facts that you may have?
I'm probably, when I have time, going to go back and rewatch all of them because I know I haven't put things together or have missed things.
Do it.
Um, I know that Angus Scrimm, who played the tall man, had laryngitis for some of these scenes, so that's why his voice suddenly gets husky.
Oh,
He,
interesting.
I thought it was interesting that he talks more in each sequel.
Yeah, because in the first one he's a boogeyman, right? And in the second
Yeah,
one he's a monster. By
and
this one, he's
a
you know
character.
he's just that guy in your life who won't leave. Like, okay, have you've seen Alien 3?
Just recently, yeah.
There's a line in Alien 3 that I always loved, even though it made no sense in Alien 3, where she says to the alien, "You've been in my life so long, I can't remember life without you," like something like that, which from her perspective makes no sense because, you know, the time that she's not been in cryosleep, the last three movies took place over like 72 hours. Um, but that's what the tall man is at this point. It's at this point he's been in these characters' lives so long, they can't imagine life without him. He's just always been there. And once that's the case, and it's so clear that you can't stop him, like I find him so creepy in this one, particularly because he feels comfortable talking, because he doesn't have any vulnerability to him. There's no sense of, oh, you're meddling in my plan, I must stop you. It's like, I'll stop you when I'm ready to stop you. And that's scary because it means that he can stop you whenever he wants.
Yeah, there's actually a YouTube video that's a compilation of all of his dialogues from all five films, and it's under 8.5 minutes.
That tracks.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think it's incredible that you have a figure like the tall man that has made such an impact on the genre of horror for those that have seen the movies, because I mean he willingly like stands alongside like some true like great horror greats like
Yeah.
Chucky, Pinhead, you know,
And
Freddy Krueger, etc.
now that you've seen him, you think back and it's like, you know what? I have seen him and the Sentinels in various ads or conventions and just didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He
Okay,
he
so
made he
sorry.
made such an impact as a horror character that you still recognize him even if you don't know who he is.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Everybody recognized Jason and Michael Myers and Freddy. And even though he's lesser known, we still know who the tall man is, whether you've actually seen him or not.
Yeah. And what a gift to an actor also that he gets to play this really memorable movie monster who doesn't have to wear any mask or makeup. He just has to be himself.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm looking now, and the director of Phantasm Ravager had worked in the art department on Bubba Hotep. He was an illustrator.
Interesting. Okay.
Um, and he worked on a lot of cartoons in the 90s and early 2000s. And
And that
he also worked on stuff in the yeah, like even recent stuff. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how he got connected to you know, to Don Coscarelli. Okay, he worked on visual effects for John Dies at the End, which was directed by Don Coscarelli. So he was a visual effects artist, and that's how he got to make a Phantasm sequel. And it looks like Don Coscarelli had a hand in writing the script, but was mostly a backseat person and let a fan of the series take over. And so it has this, you'll see, it has this labor of love vibe while also just having a very different feel from the other films.
All right, we'll say less and join us next Wednesday where we be talking and jumping into Ravager Part 5, the last one. Um we'll talk about whether or not there will be any more. But until next time, uh until we get there, Avishai, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Instagram at Avishai Oddity. That's AVISHAIODDITY. I am also on Twitter at Avishai W, but I'm spending less time there. So find me on Instagram and say hi.
Same. You know, Twitter is no longer a place that's friendly to my mental health, so
Oh my
Twitter
God.
Twitter's a cult. Twitter's never been friendly to anybody's mental health ever.
this is probably an entire
It's,
podcast in and of itself.
oh my God.
But you're about to find me in the other room eating dinner, so
Go enjoy, Mark.
Well, you guys can find us Abyss Gazing wherever you guys get your podcasts from. You guys can find Mark eating dinner and message me for the address. Uh You guys can find me. I'm on Letterboxd at Captain Nostalgia, and you guys can also follow my other podcast, That's High Praise, a Nicolas Cage podcast. Wherever you guys get your podcast from. You guys can follow our parent company, Victims and Villains. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, and wherever you guys get your podcasts from. And once again, the movie is called Blank. If you guys get a chance to check it out, please do so. It will be a well spent 30 minutes for you guys. So until next time, remember, the longer you gaze into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back into you.